I've got a problem. Tomorrow is deadlift day and my low back feels bricked up. And no, I'm not saying my low back is super excited to deadlift. I'm saying that my low back feels like there's a pair of bricks where my spinal erectors should be. And along with the crampy ass erectors shoving me into anterior pelvic tilt, it feels like I can't quite get full hip extension either. So why is this happening? If you've been around the channel, you probably know that I'm in the middle of a fairly aggressive bodyweight cut. And with that comes more cardio, more walking, more hiking, and with that comes more of my hips kind of getting a little bit freaked out. And with that hip freak out comes lumbar spine being shoved into places that it doesn't necessarily want to be. And no, I'm not saying that anterior pelvic tilt in itself is a problem, but what I am saying is that being shoved in a position that I'm not used to loading and a position that makes my leverages less efficient, that is when it can be problematic, and that is why I'm going to try to do something about it. And step one, when I get these kind of feels, is using this guy to rearrange my guts. That is a joke based on the idea that the hip flexors are such a deep muscle group that it is impossible to perform manual therapy from the front side and actually touch the hip flexors themselves. But when we understand what manual therapy actually does, and we realize that it is a neurological stimulus, not a structural one, we can then begin to understand how something like this can have value if we are trying to change the perception of the area. I know this isn't actually making my hip flexors longer. I know this isn't actually structurally changing my hip flexors, but getting in here and flossing through the anterior abdomen can make a big difference in how much range I can access from a sensory and neurological perspective. And I know tissue work is not going to solve the problem by any means, but if I can change sensory perception before I get into some more movement-based stuff, I find it a little bit easier to get more out of the movements. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to push the mace into my abdomen. I'm trying to round my lumbar spine over top of the mace, and then I'm just flossing the leg back and forth to try to get some hip extension while jamming that sucker in there. And if you don't have one of these, don't worry. You can basically stick anything into your abdomen, basketball, kettlebell, whatever you got, fist, and get the same kind of tissue work, sensory stimulus out of it. And now that the awkward part of the video is out of the way, time to shove myself into some hip extension. And I know right now you guys are probably thinking, Seth, this is like the 1000th time you film yourself doing a couch stretch, but I actually do couch stretch quite often, which you wouldn't expect by how bad my flexibility in this position looks, but I find it to be a range of motion that tends to go away very quickly for a lot of powerlifters, and tend to find it to be one that you can get a lot of benefit out of if you do spend more time in this position, creating a hip extension with knee flexion. And what I'm thinking about here is trying to squeeze glute, shove pelvis forward while I'm almost trying to leg curl with my front leg to pull me further into that hip extension stretch. I'm going to try to make it feel really nasty, and I'm going to hang out here until the nastiness kind of lets up. And I'm also going to do that on both legs. And now that I have hung out in that range, next thing to do is get myself to actually use it. So I'm going to run some hip flexor biased split squats. Hip flexor bias means that I am prioritizing squeezing the back glute, feeling a hip flexor stretch as I lower myself down, and then I'm going to try to shove my back leg forward to pick myself up from the bottom, using the hip flexors to pull myself back up to the top. And all I'm going to do here is load into that stretch, pull out, and I'm just going to do reps until I feel like the area's gotten a little bit of work, not trying to cook it here, just trying to make sure that I have control and can contract out of that end range. And once again, I'm also going to do it on both legs. Excuse me, drinking too many root beers between shots again. And now that that's done, I think the last thing to do is give myself a little bit of access to some global flexion and global extension. And for that, I'm going to use the Nocebo Bros' least favorite exercise, the Jefferson curl. I was going to stand on a box, but I didn't want to kid myself into thinking that I'm more flexible than I am. If the kettlebell touches the floor, I will be very proud of myself. But the whole idea here is that I'm going to start by squeezing my glutes. Hip extension already feels way better than it did before this. But I'm going to start with the glutes squeezed. Then I'm going to think about dropping my chin, flexing abs to pull rib cage down and trying to just segment flexion, one spinal segment at a time, segmenting through segments. Wow, groundbreaking verbiage, Seth. But basically, we're just going to try to round the back, get into some hip flexion as we're rounding, get as low as we can in a controlled manner, feel a nice little hamstring stretch. Then we're just going to slowly come up, reversing the motion, trying to go one segment at a time, nice, slow, controlled, squeeze everything at the top as we come up. And we're just going to do reps here, making sure that we're able to access that spinal flexion, making sure that we're able to round in a controlled manner, making sure we're able to access a nice hamstring stretch. And then we are going to come back up to the top. And the big important key thing here is with Jefferson curls, we don't want to be forcing ourselves further than we can control, and we don't want to be using more weight than we can control either, because if we're forcing ourselves beyond what we have control of, we're loading it beyond what we're tolerant to loading. That is when this can go from a really valuable movement to a really risky movement. And if you have your doubts or have any doubts in your ability to control a Jefferson curl, I probably wouldn't start here. I would build up tolerance to controlling flexion with something like a back raise, reverse hyper variant, or even a standing ab crunch with a rope on a lat pull down tower. That can be a good way to kind of like reverse the motion of a J curl. And there we go. Low back, hips feel pretty freaking normal after running through that stuff. And even while managing the camera recording the video, that only took me like 11 minutes. Yeah, 11 minutes and 20 something seconds to get through. So it's not like it takes a ton of time to do a little bit of prep work at home. A little bit of range of motion access, a little bit of controlling and range can go a very long way in how things feel if you are stiffened up and if stuff is tight. So guys, I think that's what I got for today. If this video helped you out, drop a comment, drop a like, share it with a friend. Peace out. Have a good rest of your day.